Well, hello, everyone. I'm Steven Petrow with the Hillsborough Arts Council, and with me today is my friend and fellow writer, John Claude Bemis, also known as John Bemis and John Claude Bemis. John, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be with you today. Yes. If you were my mom, you'd call me Johnny. She's the only one in the world that calls me Johnny.
She calls you Johnny, and we were just talking a moment ago. So you're originally from a small town in North Carolina, which, being from New York City, I'm actually not able to pronounce it the way you all pronounce it. So,
I know.
that town?
Yes, it's Oriental, North Carolina. So yes, Oriental. Well, there's an Occidental, California.
The G. Did you
What's that? Yes, and you're not supposed to pronounce the T in Oriental. It's Oriental. So, but yeah, there's Occidental California and there's Oriental North Carolina. So,
well, we're going to get to in this deeply investigative and personal interview, how you wound up with your very French name from a small eastern town in North Carolina. But for everyone who's joining us, let me give a brief introduction to John. As you say on your website, and which I completely agree, an inspiring speaker and entertaining performer, John Claude Bemis is the author of The Wooden Prince, Lord of Monsters, The Clockwork Dark Trilogy, The Prince Who Fell from the Sky, and Flora and the Runaway Rooster. You received the Excellence in Teaching Award from UNC Chapel Hill School of Education for your work in the schools as an author educator, and you've served as North Carolina's Piedmont laureate. You live here in Hillsborough, or as they say here, Hillsborough.
That's true, yeah, Hillsborough.
With your wife, Amy, and your lovely daughter, Rose.
That's right.
And not in the short bio on your website, but you are also on the board of directors of the Hillsborough Arts Council. So
I am.
Thank you for your service and all of that.
I'm glad to be a part of it.
So I want to start a little bit at the beginning, which is, how did you first come to Hillsborough and why?
Yeah, well, I went to UNC Chapel Hill, and so many of the people that go to Chapel Hill wind up staying in the area just because I think the job market's so great. And at that time, a lot of my friends, after we graduated, we were all staying in the area. I was teaching. I mostly taught 4th and 5th grade. And then my wife, Amy, and I, well, we weren't married at the time, but when we were dating, we were both in Chapel Hill. And you get to that point where you don't want to be in a college town anymore once you're out of school for too long. It just kind of felt we were lingering around the periphery of the college a little too much. And Hillsborough was just down the road. It was a place that in the 90s, was a very sleepy little town, and was a sweet place that we enjoyed just kind of coming over and walking around the downtown. But it wasn't nearly as vibrant as our little town is now. But yeah, so we wound up here in the 90s. We've been here for, 23 years now.
Yeah. So my dog is sitting over here and he's chewing on his chew stick. Does it sound like I'm grinding my teeth? Can we hear this?
Well, we are. If people are watching this in 2021, early 2021, we're still in the pandemic, so a lot of us are grinding our teeth during this time.
I want everyone to know it's actually not me. I only do that at night.
Oh yeah, me too. Massage the jaw before bed.
You came in the 90s, and that was really before this town had its reputation as this writer's mecca. And you're one of the fundamental and foundational people to it.
Oh well, thank you. But
how do you feel that we got this reputation for being a writer's and an artist town?
Well, I think a big part of it, Alan Gurganus was really, the fact when he moved in, is my understanding is, between Alan and then Lee and then a lot of other, folks that Jill and all these kind of people that started to trickle in. I'm sorry, I'm using first names and people might not be. It sounds too.
John's friends with all the famous writers here. That's Lee Smith for everyone else and Jill McCorkle.
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't mean to sound like that. It's just in a small town like this, they're just our neighbors, right? So, but I think that once, in particular with Alan Gurganus, the fact that moving in, because he moved in the 80s, right? Is my understanding, and that so some of it I think had to do with him, but some of it had to do with maybe just coincidence, the proximity between UNC and Duke and Chapel Hill, where so many writers were also teaching,
Mhm.
in the creative writing programs and so forth. So I think that was it. And so for me, moving here really had nothing to do with the writing or literary community. It was just that I loved this little town. And
Mm.
then it was only after living here for a while that I realized how many artists and creatives there were that were in the area and continue to be drawn to Hillsborough.
Yeah. No, it's every week it seems like there are more and more.
That's right. And
Being
you look at that, you look at you.
a latecomer here. So, how did you get to writing books for young people?
um it's an interesting thing because for a lot of people that know me as a writer, a question that I will sometimes get asked by people, is when are you going to write, or do you think you'll ever write a book for adults? And I don't know if you're planning on even asking me that, but that's a question that sometimes people will ask, and the truth is probably not. It's just not the way my imagination and creative interests work. But I realized when I was going into I was in the education program at UNC. I knew I wanted to become a teacher.
Mhm.
My mom's a teacher, my aunt, my grandma. I just come from a whole family of teachers, of educators. And so I was drawn to that as well. And a big draw for me in thinking about going into the classroom was being able to teach the books from my childhood that I loved, because
Mm.
I realized as I got older, even as an older teen and into my 20s, that I still enjoyed going back to Charlotte's Web and Narnia, and those books from my childhood still had a lot of appeal and love. I just felt very passionate about those books. And then being an elementary school teacher for so many years and getting to be that person who had that possibility of exposing kids for the first time to A Wrinkle in Time, to be that teacher that could introduce them to these great books like that was extraordinarily exciting and rewarding. I mean, I don't know about you, but some of those books that we read in childhood can be some of the most powerful reading experiences we have in our whole lives. That these books, I mean, was it like that for you? Did you feel like there were books when you were a young person that were just really transformative? And
I was an avid reader, um, both quality and quantity, and my parents came up with really what I think was an ingenious way to get us to read more. The rule in our house was we kept a log, and as many hours as we read in a week, we could watch that many hours of television. So if I read 20 hours, I could watch 20 hours. And
yeah, your whole life would be just consumed by,
I,
yeah.
but it was actually books then. It wasn't all screens. It was,
Yeah. Right. That's true. Right.
yeah.
Yeah. So, but also think about also. I mean, this is the other piece of it too. It's not only that I love those stories from that time period, but also the experience of reading at that age. Like, because when you think about when you were 12, 13, 14, the I mean, for me at least, when I think about it, I feel like that experience. I was so much with the reading experience was so much more immersive. Even with the best books I read now as an adult, I'm not drawn in quite the same way as I remember being as a child, where you are just totally immersed. Your imagination is just completely in this world of the book. So,
Well, let me ask you this. This is kind of a generational question, but you know, most young people these days are reading on devices, on screens, including books. Do you think that that is an equivalent experience, or how is that experience different?
well, I will say that there's a lot of the research actually suggests that young people, even teens, are really not reading books on devices that
Mhm.
much. That most people who are reading, using a Kindle or something like that, tend to be more adults than kids for whatever reason. Because that's something, yeah, I've tried to follow. I mean, of course, kids are doing a lot of reading on devices, but it's often social media kind of things.
Right.
Whereas the books that they tend to read tend to still be good old fashioned paper kind of books. I think in part it's just because it's easier for them to get a hold of some of those books, from the library or
Mhm.
from school, or just borrowing, trading with each other and things like that. And And also, I think parents are less likely to buy their kids Kindles, although they can read on nowadays. They can probably read on their phones. But so it is kind of interesting that I don't think, but I don't personally read on devices really. But I know a lot of people who do, and it seems that for some people they like having that just as an alternative. And so I don't know that I see that there would be negative consequences necessarily if kids were doing it that way. But do you find the experience of reading, whether on a device versus reading a traditional book, to be um, better or worse? Or
I sort of made a gallant effort to read books on a device, on a Kindle, and I just did not enjoy the experience in the same way, except for when I was traveling and I would be, carrying these big, heavy books.
right.
So I kind of went back to paper, but and also I have a lot of friends who are listening to books on Audible and other programs and platforms like that, which I have not made that shift to, but they swear by it.
Right.
And do you listen to books that way?
I don't that much. I do a little bit, and I know some adult friends who do as well. But I find that with a lot of the kids that I talk to about some of their reading habits and things like that is I don't see that as common with kids as I do
Yeah.
with adults. Although sometimes families enjoy listening to things together, especially on road trips. And for a lot of kids that might have dyslexia or some other kind of a challenge with their reading, those audiobooks can be incredibly helpful for them. Just for having those literacy experiences, whether just purely listening to it or listening while reading the book at the same time.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the creative process.
Sure.
And either go back in time and talk a little bit about how you developed a plot line for a book, or go forward in time and talk about something that you're working on now. But how does your creative process work, as best as you can explain it in a linear fashion in words?
Yeah, it tends to be
Process.
Yeah, no, I love thinking about the creative process, and I love talking to people and hearing about their process. And I certainly feel like everybody's got a different process for sure.
Mhm.
And part of my process tends to be spending a lot of time prior to writing a book just exploring it in my imagination and just daydreaming about
Mhm.
the characters. And that might be that writing in the car, and just if I had to take a long trip somewhere, rather than listening to the radio, sometimes I found myself just very content cutting off the radio, having it silent in the car, and just spending that time just kind of daydreaming in my imagination about what I wanted the story to be. And that is something that I know came specifically from my own childhood. I mean, part of growing up in Oriental, in Pamlico County, in such a rural place, was I didn't have people in a neighborhood with me. I didn't have, I obviously had friends, but not friends that I could see all that easily unless my parents drove me somewhere. Um, and so I did spend a lot of time on my own as a child, just back in the woods, wandering around, or even just alone in my bedroom doing some, drawing pictures and things like that. But I always had a very active imagination, and an imagination that was often drawn towards creating characters and situations and stories in my head that I just enjoyed playing out, in the way that a little kid might enjoy getting out their little Lego figures or stuffed animals and setting them up. It was almost that same kind of thing that just kind of continued on as I got older. And so when I'm for a new book, I often find that it tends to wind up being some sort of character or situation that in my imagination I just have been thinking about often for months, if not years. And during that time, I will often just make some notes on some of the things that I wind up daydreaming and thinking about. And then little by little, the idea for the story just starts to shape itself in my head until I feel that I'm ready to write, to begin putting it to paper.
And
But
when you start to write, would you say that you have the story pretty fully developed in your mind at that point, and it's then sort of
yeah,
translated?
I do. And I know that a lot of fiction writers enjoy just the discovery process of not knowing how their story is going to end, and playing and discovering it as they go along with the writing process. And I think for me, part of that discovery, that joy that I find in that comes to me more during that period when it's still just in the imaginative process. So often by the time I have, I'm ready to start writing, I want to know, I like to know where the story is going. I like to have a kind of skeleton framework of an idea of what the major arc of the story will be for this character, where they will wind up by the end, and what might be some of the adventures and situations that occur along the way. And I find that there's a lot still to discover in translating that from the imaginative process into actual words on the page.
That's interesting because as a nonfiction writer, obviously I'm doing something different, but I find that it's really necessary for me to know how the narrative arc ends to properly tell the story. So in some of the early drafts, I don't know that, but I'm sort of meandering my way towards the end. Then I get to the end, and then I kind of understand, okay, that's what this piece is about. Let me go rewrite it now so that it kind of drives in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah. So
sometimes it doesn't get there, and then it's a flawed. It's a flawed.
Right, because I have written books before where I didn't know the ending, and for me, there was a lot. There was so much more of the starting down a particular path that after I got down this direction, realized this is not where I want the story to go. And so then I would wind up having to kind of backtrack and then start again in a different direction. So, but it's all part of the process. Yeah.
So we might have just had a little freeze there. I'm not quite sure, but
oh, did we? Okay. Yeah.
Just like
we might be able to get that edited out. So.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. So I have known you for, I think, about 8 years now, which is when I moved to Hillsborough. And in that time, your daughter has grown up from being a young girl to a teenager.
Right.
Is she a built-in audience for you? How much of a role is she playing in your creative development and your storytelling? If any.
Yeah, it's been interesting because at different times, when she was a young girl, the books I tend to write are mostly for that upper elementary into middle school age audience. And so when she was younger than that, then she didn't really have a sense for what I was writing. But there was definitely during that period when she was in elementary school that I would talk that she was a source of kind of talking through some ideas. Because in general, I'm not one to want to talk about my stories to other people, even to my wife, Amy, when I'm in the process of working on them, because I sometimes feel like the ideas are a little too fragile, that sometimes I can ruin a good book just by talking about it to other people in those early stages. But I remember one day she came home and just kind of said to me, what were you working on today? And I said, well, I'll read to you just a little bit of it if you want. And I read it, and she was like, oh, she was like, I want to hear what happens next. And it's like, well, that's all I've written. And so the next day it was kind of a motivator to like, well, I've got to write a little bit more to read to her. So has been a period like that in her life. She's now, a teenager. And while I still do sometimes talk about ideas, the truth is she is not necessarily my audience, because she has very different reading tastes. I'm much more of that kind of nerdy type who likes, fantasy and adventures and magic and all this kind of, these kind of things. Whereas she's much more, as a reader, she tends to like more realistic fiction. And so we, to each their own. Yeah.
Their own. There are many books for many different types.
That's right. That is right.
A good segue, though. I believe you're going to read something for us.
I would love to read just a little bit to you. Yeah. So a little taste from a book that is one of the more recent books that I've had published. It's a book called The Wooden Prince, and it is a reimagining of the Pinocchio story. But of course, if you have read the original Pinocchio story or seen the Disney movie, my Pinocchio is not quite like that one. This is he's not a little toy who comes to life. He is this world where the story takes place. It's kind of a reimagining of the Venetian Empire but into the Renaissance era. And this is a world where they are able to build, some of Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines are actually able to be built. And they're also building these wooden servants and soldiers called automa. And Pinocchio is one of them. So here's a little taste from the beginning. By the time Pinocchio arrived in the village of San Baldovino, he was bursting with impatience to get free. Being locked in a trunk shouldn't have bothered him. He was an automa, after all. Back in the palace where he came from, Pinocchio had been locked in closets and stored away in cupboards with the other mechanical servants all the time. Never bothered him before. But since he had been locked in this trunk, he was changing. Pinocchio shouted and tried to kick the inside of the trunk, but with his wooden knees pressed to his wooden chest, he didn't have much room to make a kick. He wriggled and twisted, tangling his smock shirt and tearing his leggings until he became aware of muffled voices outside the trunk. "Let me out," he cried. A moment later came the sound of squealing nails being pried from the lid. When the trunk was opened, Pinocchio stretched out his legs and sat up with a puff of relief. Two figures stared at him. The closest was an automa butler with chipped paint on his wooden face, wearing a moth-eaten black suit. The automa butler held the axe that had been used to pry open the lid. The other was an elderly man with a bright red nose and watery red eyes that struggled to focus on Pinocchio. "Otto, give us more light," the old man wheezed. The automa butler tipped back the crown of his head, exposing a gas flame that hissed to life from his skull. The orange light illuminated racks and racks of wine bottles, filling a cobweb-draped cellar. "It's just an automa, Captain Toro," the old man called. "Put down your gun. It's no danger to us." Pinocchio realized that a third man was in the cellar. He turned to see an imperial airman in dingy armor, great mechanical wings folded against his back, and he had a long-barreled musket aimed at Pinocchio. So poor Pinocchio, he's in big trouble at the opening of the story, and as my stories tend to go, it's just one mishap and a misadventure after another. So,
That was wonderful, and thank you for sharing with us.
oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
So I know that you work with young people in other ways too, as a coach and as a teacher.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that part of your life?
Yes, I think for so many of us who are working artists, it can be helpful also to have another side to your professional life besides just the writing, and so I do a lot of teaching, and honestly, it's something that I really love. I came into being a writer because I was a classroom teacher for so many years, and I did not leave the classroom because I was unhappy at all with being. If circumstances were such that I was back in the classroom teaching, I would be incredibly happy. I loved it. I just got to a point where I was trying to do both, and the writing and the teaching were two full-time jobs, and I was not able to do it anymore. And so, but I'm very fortunate now that I get to, in pre-COVID days, visit a lot of schools. That was a big part of my job, was doing presentations in schools. But a nice thing about during this time is that I've been able to do a lot more teaching online. Classes to kids, classes to teens, and classes to adults. I mean, right now I've got 4 weekly classes that are going on for various ages. And I just love it so much. I love getting to know those students. I love, all of them are there because they love writing and they enjoy, we all kind of share this enjoyment of it. I'm not having to twist anybody's arm to come to class. They all love it. So it's, and it's, of course, unlike when I was in the classroom as a regular classroom teacher, there's no discipline issues to to handle. So.
They're all just terrified of you, in other words.
Right. Yes. I will smack them on the back of the hand across Zoom if they get out of line. So especially the adults. So yeah.
So do you think any kid can become a writer?
I do. I absolutely do. I'm one of those people that in general just feels like any sort of talent can be cultivated. That if you have the passion and you put in the time to do it, um, that yes, you can you can become that artist, that creative, and so I certainly think that with writers. I've had kids also. In fact, I did an interview that's going to be part of this Hillsborough Arts Council Writer Series, where I
Mhm.
interviewed one of my former teen students who is now at Ringling School for Art and Design in the creative writing program, and he's dyslexic. He talks about it in this interview, how he, when he was a young kid, and those one things I asked him. I was like, why would someone who is dyslexic, that what you would think would, who really struggles with a lot of this, putting words on the page and reading, how does someone like that become a writer? That's your, and he just loved the storytelling process so much that he found ways around it. Found ways to use kind of speech to text technology, and so it's fascinating. So in other words, there's that really, this is one of the wonderful things about being a writer, is that it isn't, you don't have to buy an expensive instrument, you don't have to buy a lot of equipment. All you just need a pencil and paper, maybe a laptop, and an imagination. I mean, the
Mhm.
imagination portion of it is, really the biggest thing. So
And I think there are many people who don't feel that they have an imagination, but when you kind of dig down a little bit deeper, I think we all do in some way. And it's like one of those muscles that you have to cultivate a little bit, and then it's stronger and it grows, and there you have the wooden prince.
right, and not all of us might sing, for example, and not all of us might doodle or draw, but
Mhm.
it would. I think that I could probably safely say that there is no human being that that does not tell stories. We all tell stories. Every day of our life we tell stories in some capacity or another. Um,
That kind of raises for me the question about, why is storytelling important? Why is it important to an individual, to families, and even to communities? And we're going to have the postman come in right now, which means the dog is going to bark.
all right.
We're going to have a brief interlude.
Yes. See, and that's a story right there. It helps to make sense of what we're about to have. So there we
Yeah,
go.
I predicted the future. It's okay.
Yeah. It was foreshadowing. It was foreshadowing. You're
That was
right.
foreshadowing.
we're
And
building we're building the suspense towards that moment. When will he bark? And then he did.
So storytelling, why is that important?
Well, I think that again, it's just a fundamental part of being a human being and trying to make sense of the world. I think in part, we do that as a way of processing and making sense of the events around us. But also, I'm no anthropologist, but I would imagine also that we, as human beings, unlike animals, like we want to pass things down, that we want to pass along information, we want to pass along our values to others, and that stories have always been a fundamental way of sharing our beliefs, our values, those. And so I think that they show up even in fiction today. I mean, there's been some interesting research that has, that's shown that like kids who were avid readers of the Harry Potter books scored higher on empathy tests. I think that when we read, and because reading, this is one of the things that I think is so fascinating, is that and I might be deviating a little bit from what we're talking about here, just purely with why we tell stories, but from the reading experience, and I would say that this is true for so many stories that we tell, is that we have this wonderful opportunity to be in the head of another person. There is no other opportunity in life where we get to see the world through somebody else's eyes. Everything else is always, experienced just through our own eyes. We can only guess at what others are thinking and feeling. But in a story, in fiction, in a book, we actually get that opportunity to be in someone else's head, see how someone else sees the world, and you just, in a way, you really don't get that in movies, um, or other forms of storytelling. It's something that seems relatively unique to fiction writing. So,
There was this professor at Stanford he does a lot of research on empathy, and he has a book out called The War for Kindness.
Hmm.
And there are a couple of chapters about the importance of reading, to your point, that it helps us to meet different kinds of people, to engage with them on their own terms and sometimes equal terms. And I had, until I read that research, I had never actually thought that that was one of the benefits of reading. But clearly it is on the science side, and clearly it is on the humanities side.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. So, and I think
Yeah.
it's also it's one of those things like, they say like laughter is something that kind of triggers a response in us that helps us to kind of connect with other people, to feel a sense of security with others. And so when we have certain things that we shared stories in a way might be one of those things also that kind of bond and connect people together, even though often today the experience of reading a book might often be solitary. Traditionally, stories would have been something that would have been more, especially in an oral tradition, would have been shared more or performed. But I still think even the today, even though you might read a book all by yourself, I know kids and teens and adults that then still want to talk to others, find out who else is reading it. That becomes important to be able to talk about that together. That we've shared this experience, we speak this language, we understand who this character is. Let's talk about it.
And I have actually found that the case among our contemporaries too, especially during the pandemic, where either, we're watching Netflix or we're reading. And so I have lots of conversations with my friends, what are you reading? What engaged you? And then I will follow suit and we'll talk about it. And that was not such a prevalent theme in my life before March 2020. I
Yeah.
mean,
Right. Yeah.
and it was kind of much more of a solipsistic, you know what I'm trying to say. Uh, so before I let you go, I've got a couple of other questions. You were Piedmont laureate.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about how you achieved that crown and what.
Yeah, right. I know they should give us a little laureate to wear. I think that yeah.
You and others have worked very hard in that role, but especially you. So tell us about that.
So yes, the Piedmont Laureate program, it's a wonderful, really wonderful program put on by the various arts councils in the Triangle, Durham and Raleigh and Orange. Um, and I think we're on our 13th Piedmont Laureate now. Jackie Shelton Green
Mhm.
was the first one. And each year, the Piedmont Laureate program, it's meant to kind of celebrate writing and literature. And so each year they pick a writer in a different field. Jackie Shelton Green represented it in poetry. We've had quite a few from Hillsborough, by the way. We had Zelda Lockhart, who represented it for fiction writing. And then another year when fiction writing came back up again, Nancy Peacock was chosen for it. But they've had it also in creative nonfiction, in playwriting, in a lot of different fields. I was the Piedmont laureate for children's literature, and this year, 2021, they have their first, or I should say, they have their second Piedmont laureate now. For children's literature, and it's Kelly Starling's Lyons from Raleigh, and she's an extraordinary children's book writer, just a really wonderful representative for that community. So, yeah.
And what are the responsibilities that come with the title?
Oh, well, you're meant to put on a lot of public events, and so it's really just meant to be a year that through doing, for Kelly this year, I'm imagining she's going to have to just do a lot online, obviously, and I would love for people to look up, the Piedmont Laureate program,
Mhm.
and to see what she's got planned for 2021, to find some of her events and follow. Even if you're not in the world of children's literature, this is part of the opportunity here with the Piedmont Laureate program, is that these programs are kind of celebrating a different field of writing and literature, and so it's an opportunity to learn a little bit um, about that aspect of creative writing. So, but yeah, that's really the big responsibility, putting on some events to promote and celebrate writing. Yeah.
Fantastic. And is that funded by the state or by the counties or?
It comes from the various arts councils: Orange,
Mhm.
Durham, the Raleigh, Wake, the United Arts Council, Wake County, and there's been some others that have come in at various times. I think Chatham was in for a little bit, and Johnson, and they kind of float in and out. But it's really just funded by those various arts councils, so a
Wonderful.
joint partnership. Yeah.
So I started off when I introduced you with your formal name, John Claude Bemis.
Right.
Names are about identity and who we are. So I've known you for a while. I don't know the history of your name. So I'm really curious to know.
People always, it's so funny, like that, it's so often, well, actually, if you punch in Jean, Jean Claude Bemis and Google, like that'll produce just as many results for me as the as John Claude Bemis, because it's been misspelled so many times. And there's so many people that do think that it's Jean Claude, like it's French or something like that. But no, my family is very Southern. I don't think that my parents had no sense for that being or no, didn't really realize that that was even a common French name, Jean Claude. But the year that I was born, with 1972, Jean Claude Keely was this all of a sudden this like the star of the Olympics that year as this French skier. And so that was when they realized that, oh, well, because, and then I think when I was born, everyone kept asking my parents, did you name your son for Jean Claude Keely? Like but it's John Claude. This other, my grandfather was Claude, and my godfather was John. So it had that together. And I was called John Claude by my family up until I went to kindergarten. And apparently my first day of kindergarten, when my teacher said John Claude, I raised my hand and said, I'm just John. And I remained just John for many years. And then when I became a professional writer, and I had to decide on what the name was going to be on my book, I decided to re-embrace the John Claude. So.
Well, that is a great answer. I had wondered whether you were originally like one of the Southern double names, like Laura Ann, John Claude.
Right. And so, yes, a lot of people and a lot of my relatives still call me John Claude. Yeah, it's that double name, that Southern double name thing. So absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you for spending some time with us at the Hillsborough Arts Council today. And that everyone who's listening, you can find out much more about John Claude Bemis at johnclaudebemis.com. And you can find his books here in town at Purple Crow, which is owned by our wonderful friend Sharon Wheeler. Nancy Best is often too, and we encourage you to shop local and buy lots of John's books. And just want to say thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to get to chat with you today, Stephen. Thank you so much for doing this.
Likewise, and hello to your family and stay safe.
Thank you.